All right, welcome to the novel Their Eyes Were Watching God. So this novel was written by Zora Neale Hurston, and you should recognize her. She wrote the short story Sweat that we read earlier this year. The novel itself was published in 1937, and she wrote it very, very quickly. 7 weeks is not that long to write a novel. I mean, think about that's less than a quarter of, in school. So she wrote this in a very compressed time. She's become known for her studies in anthropology, and so what she did is she went and just observed and recorded what she saw. And so the challenging part of this novel is the dialect. If you remember from the short story Sweat, the narrator themselves in her stories, they speak in standard English, but the characters, when they're speaking in dialogue, so anything enclosed in quotation marks, they will speak in dialect. And so essentially a word is spelled the way it sounds. It's spelled phonetically. And these characters, they live in Florida. They speak in Southern accents. So what's very interesting about this novel, and I think pretty cool, is if you read the dialogue aloud, you're speaking in a Southern accent, even if you don't naturally have one. But the thing that does frustrate students about this novel is if you are a speed reader, you are going to have to slow down because you can't, they're not sight words, you can't like just read the word and process it. You have to either out loud or whisper or in your mind pronounce some of these words out loud. So that's the only challenge of this novel. It's a great novel, it's got very clear meaning, excellent novel to use on the AP exam, but you have to be patient. I promise that if you stick with it for 3 or 4 chapters, even less than that, you're going to get the dialect. It's not going to bother you that much. The only inconvenience, it'll slow you down a tiny bit, but it'll help you to kind of get captured into the time period. So a little bit of background on this novel. It's a historic example of Black fiction. There's some feminist overtones rather. Janie is the protagonist, and she's on a journey to find herself and true love. This novel comes in the middle of our Search for Meaning unit. If you remember Hamlet, Hamlet loved to philosophize. He would think about, what is the meaning of life? I've been taught, to be quite religious, but I need to always check and make sure for myself that I'm doing things for the right reason, that I'm not just following what someone tells me I should be doing. So Hamlet was on a journey to find meaning. In The Stranger, we sort of have the opposite of that. I mean, in essence, the protagonist in The Stranger did find meaning, but his meaning was that there is no meaning. So this whole unit is about a search for meaning and how humans in general find meaning in life. And I know I've asked you to write about this before in this unit, but I do want you to think back to that question. How do you find meaning in your own life? And I wrote this on several responses. You're only, 17, 18 years old. It's not expected that you know what the meaning of life is or what the meaning in your life is, but it's something that you should always be thinking about and seeing, do I have a direction that's, guiding my life? So what we're doing in AP Literature is seeing how literature as an art form helps to guide that meaning for some. So this novel has a much more clear-cut meaning. Janie, if you look at the picture on the screen here, she is under a pear tree, and she's looking at the blossoms, the flowers, and the bees, and she has this epiphany. This is chapter 2. It's not going to be a spoiler. It is the most important scene of the entire novel, because this, which she experiences as a young woman, essentially defines the rest of her life. So her meaning is very clear-cut. It's like the total opposite of Marceau from The Stranger. The setting is the South in the mid-1900s. So think about what you know about this time period. We're after the Civil War, but we're before civil rights. And so there was a lot of racism and discrimination going on. Black communities were separate for sure. And this takes place in Eatonville, which is it's the first incorporated all-black town in America. Because of the time period, Janie, she's kind of in a transition in terms of her own life, but in terms of history. So her grandmother actually lived through slavery, and so her grandmother, who ends up raising Janie, is shaped by her experience as a literal slave. Janie's mother didn't experience the oppressiveness of that, and so Janie's mother kind of ran off and did her own thing. So Janie is caught between her grandmother, who had one experience, her mother, who had a totally different experience, and she's kind of looking for a guiding force in her life. She's in this transitionary period, and so this epiphany under the pear tree is what guides her. Some elements to understand, and this first one, the first time I read this novel, the very first time, I forgot when I got to the ending that it was a frame story. So chapter 1, it's going to start in the middle of the action, if you remember your illusion in medias res. And Janie is walking back. She's in overalls, she's muddy, she's filthy. People are watching her, they're judging her, they're trying to get information about her. We, the reader, have no idea what in the world is happening. It's right in the middle of things, and then it's going to flash back. So Janie shows up, she returns to Eatonville. We don't know what that means. Where was she? Has she always been in Eatonville? And she recounts the story to her friend Phoebe, and I'm pretty sure Phoebe is spelled with an E, not a Y. She tells the story of her childhood in West Florida, and then how she got to Eatonville, what happened in Eatonville, what happened after, which led her to be covered in mud and wearing overalls and things like that, and finally what led her to return. So it is a frame story, and I'll remind you when we get to the end to go back and reread chapter 1 because it makes a whole lot more sense after you've heard the story to come back and understand like why people are judging her, why is she wearing overalls covered in mud, etc. To give you a physical example of where the story takes place, so we're in Florida the whole time. West Florida, labeled on the map, is where Janie grew up. And then at some point, and I won't give away spoilers, she made her way to Eatonville. And if you've been to Disney in Florida, it's kind of in that general area. You can see where Tampa is, Orlando rather. And then at some point, again, I'm not going to give spoilers, she goes to the Everglades and then comes back to Eatonville. It is in Eatonville where the novel opens, where she's walking back in overalls, where she's being judged, and that's where she returns at the end to tell her story. Some elements to understand, I mentioned this, dialect is definitely used. Many, many years after this novel was published, I mean, people still look back at it. It's a way to find just genuine examples of the way people spoke at the time. And I always do very badly when I read this, but if you look at the word capital AH, and it's always going to be capitalized, it's not like it's the pronoun I. So if you read this out loud, you are forced to speak in a Southern accent. All right, let's see if I can do this. I was with them white chillin' so much I didn't know I wasn't white till I was around 6 years old. Not that great. I had a student a couple years ago who I taught in southeastern Virginia, and he had a Southern accent anyway, and he was amazing at reading the dialect out loud. But even me who grew up in Connecticut and doesn't have a Southern accent naturally, it makes it easy for me to sound a little bit Southern. And with a little more practice, I could definitely sound more genuine than that, I think. So what frustrates students, especially if you're a really strong reader, and most of you are, obviously, because you're in AP Literature, it does slow you down. If you read that quote in your head, it's going to take much, much longer than if it were written in standard English. The good news is it's only in dialogue. It's only when characters are speaking to one another. The narrator does not speak in dialect. And although it's going to be an adjustment compared to probably what you normally read, I think by the third chapter you'll be fine, and it's actually enjoyable. It kind of takes you into another time and another place. I always like to watch historical movies just because I feel like I'm being taken to another time and experiencing almost like time travel. It's the same thing. Figurative language. You could probably open up your book to a random page, close your eyes and point, and it's highly likely that you're pointing to a metaphor, a simile, symbolism, or something that's related to a metaphor, imagery, symbolism, some kind of figurative language that's extended. So this text is rich with it. Lots of imagery. Questions pelted her back. So this is when she's first entering the town of Eatonville. We know nothing about why she's there or being judged, but the questions are pelting her back. It's like an attack, right? They're not just asking questions, they're pelting her with questions. And when they're pelting her back, she's trying to avoid answering the questions. So even just a simple sentence like that, you could write an entire paragraph. Why are the questions pelting her back? What is the author trying to show? So this text, it's kind of the opposite of The Stranger. The Stranger is super sparse. There's only really 2 scenes in The Stranger, the attack scene and then the kind of epiphany at the end where he screams at the chaplain. There's only 2 scenes that are really rich with language in The Stranger. Their Eyes Are Watching God is the total opposite. The entire text is rich with just beautiful language. Symbolism, I know I mentioned the pear tree before. This is Janie's awakening. It's her epiphany. She defines her entire life based on this experience that happened when she was 17. And I know I've said it and said it and said it. It's chapter 2. You have to keep the pear tree in mind. Anytime you write an essay about Their Eyes Are Watching God, I don't care what the topic is, you have to mention the pear tree. It's impossible not to. So the AP open-ended question, I just wanted to go over this just to keep you, thinking about the AP exam. There is that open question, And at the end of this quarter, we are going to write a sample open question. And you'll be asked to use a long work that we read this year. So Their Eyes Were Watching God, The Stranger, and Hamlet. I'll be sure that I pick a question that could be answered with all three of those. So here's an example. Many works of literature include scenes depicting parties, banquets, feasts, funerals, and other occasions. Choose a work of literature from the list below. They might give you a list, they might not. Don't bother reading the list. Just a work of literary merit, to explain how such a scene contributed to the meaning of the work as a whole. So over the course of the rest of the year, we're going to prepare 3 pieces, novels or plays, that you know very well and that you can answer such a question with. Obviously, after we read this novel, you'll have 3, Hamlet, The Stranger, and Their Eyes Were Watching God. Hamlet and The Stranger are a little bit less typical. Hamlet, he is a typical protagonist, but he just thinks and thinks and thinks so much that he doesn't take action. If you really understand Hamlet well, it would be a good piece to use to answer this question. If you feel like your knowledge of Hamlet is shaky, I would choose one of the other 2 works. The Stranger is a great work to use, but because it's not a traditional story, not all of the questions the AP exam asks are going to perfectly align with The Stranger. But Their Eyes Were Watching God is not only a traditional story, but it's so rich with things that you can write about that literally any question they ask you, you could use Their Eyes Were Watching God to answer. And by the end of the year, we should have read also The Life of Pi, so you can use that one for your AP exam as well. But just keep this in mind. We are going to be writing one of these types of essay prompts at the end of this unit. All right, that's all I have for you. As you read, be ready on reading due dates for things like quizzes and activities and such that we'll do in class. So just make sure you have read the assigned reading each time it's due. Check our class page for those reading dates. And as I said before, if it does snow and a reading, set of chapters was supposed to be due on a snow day, it'll be due the following day that we're back. So just, use snow days to read. It's a really good use of time. All right, I will talk to you guys next class. Have a great weekend.